What's the Torah that the world needs to hear? The Torah that the world needs to hear is from all over the world. It's from people who don't normally teach Torah, even though they do teach. It's musical voices, as well as the voice of the classroom. It's from people who write for newspapers or who build banks, people who work in politics, people who have family traditions, and people who have come to the Jewish tradition on their own. As you will hear, we believe that the Torah the world needs to hear is Torah from everywhere. It's true that Torah scholars have an enormous amount to bring us, and you will hear some wonderful Torah scholars teach from the depth of their learning and from the unfathomable riches of our tradition. But there is a midrash, there is a rabbinic teaching that when God gave the Torah at Sinai, every Israelite saw it as a mirror because it reflected who they were. And so everyone has some Torah to teach. And the deeper and richer and more profound the experience of your life, the deeper and richer and more profound the Torah teaching you have. That's why we did not ask any of our contemporaries, the other very wonderful rabbis and teachers and writers in Los Angeles, because we thought it was important to show people how diverse and widespread and wonderful is the experience of learning Torah. That you can learn it with a Broadway songwriter, and that you can learn it with a sociology professor, and you can learn it with a female Sephardic rabbi who teaches in Jerusalem. And all of them bring depth, and all of them bring their special experience to our Torah. You know, God comes to Abraham in the 12th chapter of Genesis and says, go, and never tells Abraham where he's going. Lech lecha me'artzcha, go from your land. And that key moment becomes the paradigm for the Jewish journey. We are a people that has a physical destination, but we have no ultimate spiritual destination while in this world. In fact, if you look at the Torah, the remarkable thing about the 5 books of Moses is that the Israelites end it while still in the wilderness, because that's where we are, all of us, in the wilderness. We know that these days more powerfully than ever. And in the wilderness, just like the ancient Israelites, what we have to do is seek one another and look at our map, our guide, the Torah, and find the way together. So we present you with wonderful voices who help us on our journey. Shavuot is the time when we receive the Torah, and we have to be ready to do so. So I will conclude with a beautiful story that a friend once told me about a class he took in Jerusalem. It was a class from a famous Kabbalistic teacher. And he walked into the class for the first time, and the teacher greeted him the way he did every student. He walked up to him and he held an apple. And so he reached out to grab it, and the teacher pulled it back. And he held it out again. And he went to grab it again, but more slowly this time, and still the teacher pulled it back. Until finally he looked at the other students and they showed him what he should do. And the third time the teacher held out the apple and he went like this. And the teacher dropped it in his hands. Sometimes it is easy to grab, but hard to receive. I hope that as you listen to these voices and this wisdom, you will receive.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joe Sanberg, co-founder of Aspiration.com. I hope you're well and healthy. The Torah that I think the world needs to hear right now is from Shoftim, which is Deuteronomy 16:20. And Shoftim says, "Justice, justice shall you pursue, so that you may live." I think there are two resonant elements to the Shoftim during this moment. The first is the call to pursue justice. It doesn't say, "Justice, justice shall you achieve." It says, "Justice, justice shall you pursue." And I think that's a reminder that God judges us on the sincerity and the intensity of our pursuit. And at a time like this pandemic, when the problems of the world are more overwhelming, not just for a person, but even for nations, Shoftim is a call that we just need to keep putting one foot in front of the other in the continuous pursuit of justice. And the second part of Shoftim that I think we all need to remember and hear now is this notion that we should pursue justice so that we may live. As we think about what life means, as we use a lot of this time to reflect on our future and all the chaos and uncertainty in the world, we're asking ourselves, what is the point of it all? What is the meaning of it all? And Shoftim's suffix that justice, justice shall you pursue so that you may live is a reminder that it's the pursuit of justice, the pursuit of perfecting God's creation in our own lives that brings our life meaning and purpose. I'd also add and conclude by saying Shoftim is my Torah portion. September 5th, 1992, I read from the Torah in front of the congregation, Temple Beth Shalom in Orange County for the first time, and my Torah portion was Shoftim. Justice, justice shall you pursue so that you may live. Wishing everyone health, peace, and hope to see you around.
I've always found it strange that each year, Jews across America show up at our synagogues for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and obediently recite the responsive readings, which frequently refer to God, but we never really talk about what we mean when we say that word, God. And as a kid, I had the impression that the Jewish God was a man in the sky who controls everything and rewards us if we're good and punishes us if we're bad and really enjoys our repetitive prayers. I didn't buy that idea as a kid, and I still don't buy that idea today. But for many years, I figured that my only options were either that man in the sky God or atheism, or perhaps being spiritual but not religious, whatever that means. But it turns out that's actually not true. It turns out there is no dogma or doctrine or universally accepted definition of God in Judaism. We as Jews have the humility to believe that when we talk about God, we're talking about something so big and vast and beyond the scope of our tiny human minds to explain or articulate or categorize or define. Instead, what we have are centuries of Jewish thinkers articulating different conceptions of the divine based in part on their own experiences. Now, you've got the mystics who say that God is everything. You're all God. I'm God. The idea that there's any barrier between us is an illusion. There's thinkers like Martin Buber, who says that God is what arises in deep human relationship between two people who are being fully vulnerable to each other, fully contemplating each other's humanity. What arises between them is God. You have thinkers like Mordecai Kaplan, who says that God is the process by which we each become our highest and truest selves. Now, none of this is systematic theology. It's often filled with contradictions. If you look at the ancient rabbis, they said that God was both transcendent, beyond all time and space and human imagination, but also very much immanent, right here in the world with us, available for human relation. Even in the Torah, you see all kinds of contradictions. There are moments when God is all-powerful, in control of everything, and then there are moments where God is totally caught off guard by the behavior of human beings who God actually created. Even in the scene when God comes to Moses in the burning bush, my friend Rabbi James Jacobson Mazels points out that at one point, when Moses asks God what God's name is, God replies, "I will be what I will be." Unknowable, unpredictable. But in the same scene, God says to Moses, "I will be with you." Present, reliable. In a moment when we're seeing so much human suffering, many of us are starting to ask bigger questions and wondering what Judaism may have to offer us. And I actually think that it has a great deal of spiritual wisdom, much of which is very relevant at this time. So I think it might be time that we started talking a little bit more about God.
As a freshman in college many years ago, I took a year-long course called Politics and Values. It was an illuminating course. I learned a great deal. But especially memorable to me as I look back now is a rule that was imposed by our instructor, whose name was Dr. Roll, to govern our lively classroom debates. Before anyone could challenge another student's opinion, he or she first had to summarize it to prove that they truly understood the point they were taking issue with. When you have to restate arguments you don't agree with, it makes it a little harder to treat an honest difference of opinion with the kind of contempt and disdain that have become all too common in our social media and public discourse. As far as I know, Dr. Roll wasn't Jewish and didn't know anything about Talmud, but his classroom rule echoed a famous passage in the Talmudic Masechet Eruvin. Listen. Amar Rabbi Abba Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Abba taught in the name of Shmuel. Shalosh shanim nechlaku Beit Shammai uVeit Hillel. For 3 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, that is the academies of Shammai and Hillel, had a disagreement. Halalu omrim halacha kamotenu, v'halalu omrim halacha kamotenu. Each group insisted the halacha, Jewish law, follows our point of view. Yatsa Batkol, a voice from heaven was heard to proclaim, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim hein, v'halacha kebeit Hillel. Both this one and that one are the words of the living God, but the practical halacha follows the school of Hillel. Judaism doesn't frown on arguments when they are sincere attempts to get at the truth and to figure out what's right. Not even heated arguments like this one, which lasted for 3 years. Heaven itself, so to speak, acknowledges that both sides of an honest dispute can have merit, can be the words of the living God. But the story in the Talmud doesn't end there. Here's what it says next. If in fact it was true that both camps, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, taught the words of the living God, then why were the scholars of Beit Hillel privileged to have the halacha established according to their approach? Answer, because they were agreeable and respectful, gentle in their manner and forbearing. V'shonin divrei hen v'divrei Beit Shammai. And when Beit Hillel's people were teaching and debating, they would explain both their own arguments and the arguments of Beit Shammai, their opponents. V'lo od, and not only that, ela shemakdimin divrei Beit Shammai ledivrei hen, but they would explain the Beit Shammai opinion before they expressed their own. Just like we had to do in Professor Roll's class 19 centuries later. The sages of the Talmud knew how tempting it is, when you're sure you're correct and the other side is wrong, to give in to self-righteousness and arrogance and intolerance. The Torah warns against that. Competing worldviews are fine. We don't all have to agree with each other. There isn't just one correct approach to Torah and Jewish law, and neither is there just one correct way to make sense of the secular world. Honest people can have honest debates. There isn't only a single acceptable, sound answer to questions of public policy, or economics, or criminal justice, or foreign affairs. But there is just one correct way to argue, just one way that heaven truly smiles upon. at a time when nastiness and incivility seem to have taken over so much of the public discourse. In this age of polarized partisanship, when so many people can't seem to disagree without demonizing and belittling and even hating people on the other side. This is truly Torah the world needs now. Argue with passion by all means, but be nochin va'aluvin, respectful, modest, courteous, open-minded. Acknowledge the legitimacy of other points of view. Take pains to understand those who disagree with you. Strive to be like the disciples of Hillel, who made their case as strongly as they could without ever insulting the disciples of Shammai or distorting their words. Chag Sameach.
Shalom. This is the Torah the world should hear. A Torah from Jerusalem, where I am, that the world is welcome to hear. And it's spoken in a very soft voice of a woman who, at the beginning, was foreign to our story, came from a completely different world, and yet became our ancestor. Thanks to her, we all received David the king and so much of the beauty of our people and our tradition. A woman called Ruth, who really is the hero of the celebration of Shavuot and the story which we read on Shavuot. And when her life completely changes, when her husband dies, her reality is shaken. In that moment, she decides a decision, and she says to her mother-in-law, "Don't urge me to leave you. Don't urge me to turn my back to you." She understands that it's a choice. Even in the midst of uncertainty, of tragedy, it's a choice not to turn our back. Our sages teach us that Ruth is Torah, that it's the same root, same letters, and that Torah teaches us never to turn our back. Torah actually is a training school, telling us that in the better days of history, we train ourselves for the days that are going to be very challenging, like these days now. And then what we do is that we remind ourselves and remember that we still have a choice, even in days of Corona. We have a choice not to turn our back, to show our face. In every generation, we have that choice. And in every moment of life, we have that choice. To be present, to see each other, to give each other strength and hope and prayer and friendship. It's amazing to know that this is really a journey. The journey of deciding to show a face to each other. It started already in Egypt with another woman, the daughter of Pharaoh, who looks around her, say the sages, and understands that everyone is turning their back to each other, people to people, and she will not be a part of it. And she goes down to the river and looks for one face that she wants to look at, to make sure that she looks at. And she sees a little basket and she knows, say the sages, that this child is Jewish. And she opens the basket and looks at him, and he looks back at her. And the course of history will change from that moment on. And it's amazing to think about it, that at Sinai, the revelation, more than anything else, was a people who fled from a place where people show the back to each other and arrive to a place where people stand around sanctity, around Sinai, and look at each other's faces and show each other their face. This is a moment in which we can all choose. Moments like these were always in history, and they await us now. How can we find a way to show each other a face? I think the choice of saying Torah to each other, wherever we are, from Zion, from Jerusalem here, to Sinai, to Los Angeles, that is the choice of showing each other a face, giving each other hand and hope through Zoom, and making sure that we remember that we are one, and that we are going to go through this, and eventually be able to even meet face to face, panim el panim. Every Shabbat, we train to do that. Every Shavuot, when we receive the Torah, we train ourselves to do that. And this is a moment in which we arise and really do so, in this very moment, studying together Torah. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov says that the face is the door to everything. We see, we breathe, we smell, we listen. And that he says that we do so by studying Torah as we are doing right now, by praying for each other as we are doing, and also by breathing for each other. And he says every time we study Torah, there's a little dove, a little bird in our heart, which is made of the heart, wrapped by lungs, which are 2 wings. And every time we send Torah to each other, it's as if we open the wings of the dove and we send it far away from Jerusalem to Sinai. And we send it, saying that there's a flood right now, like Noach's flood, and yet it will pass, and that we can pass it. We can go through it and meet at the other side. And in the meantime, guard ourselves and also show each other's faces to each other. Send strength, send Torah, send prayer and friendship. I send it from here. And at the end of this flood, I hope to meet panim el panim, face to face, either here in Jerusalem or at Sinai. Chag Sameach and healing for all.
Hi everybody, it's Barry Weiss here talking to you from Pittsburgh. I really wish I was in LA tonight to celebrate Shavuot with all of you. Really just to be in a room with other people would be great, any people, but especially with all of you. And I can't wait to be out in LA, back in your community again sometime soon. I just want to leave you with a simple message, and that is a message about what is essential. If there is a word that has typified this entire pandemic crisis, it is that word, essential. It has forced us to look at the way we live and to ask what is vital, what is absolutely necessary, what can't we live without? And I think it's a really, really good opportunity in this moment to ask those questions about the Jewish community. What is essential? Is it essential to make sure that there is a safety net for people that work in our assisted living homes and JCCs? Is it essential to make sure that money is never a barrier to a full Jewish life? Essential to make sure that anyone who wants to send their child to a Jewish day school or a Jewish summer camp has that opportunity? Is it essential that the most vulnerable in our community are never made to feel that way? Is it essential that a Jew in America never goes hungry? Is it essential to have fancy galas and fancy bar mitzvah parties and fancy weddings? They're nice, but maybe not essential. There is a phrase that was either coined or popularized by Rahm Emanuel, right? You all know it. Never let a crisis go to waste. Let's not let this crisis go to waste. Let's use it as an opportunity in our language of Judaism, for tshuva, for return, a return to what is ultimately essential. And I think, and I want to bless you all with the clarity to be able to see it. I think that, there's a lot of hardness and tragedy in this moment, but I also believe that it is an incredible opportunity to remind us of what matters. Thank you all so much, and Chag Sameach. Bye-bye.
Greetings. I'm Paul Root Wolpe, the Raymond Shinazi Professor of Jewish Bioethics and the Director of the Center for Ethics at Emory University. Our world has been rocked by a global pandemic that seems to many of us like it's been going on forever, though in fact we may be just at the beginning. Epidemiologists are predicting a possible second and third wave through the fall and the spring. Workplaces that have started slowly to open up may have to close again. And we, all of us, may have to rethink how we worship, how we shop, how we entertain ourselves, how we move through our day-to-day lives. I want for a moment to explore this with you, and I want to start with an incident in the Torah that has always fascinated me, a place where Moshe does something that, to me at least, seems hard to understand. It occurs in Numbers, Bamidbar, chapter 11, verse 11. We'll get to what happens in a moment, but let me set the stage first. Moshe has led his people out of Egypt. He's confronted and defeated the most powerful Pharaoh, the most powerful leader in the world. He's liberated a group of slaves, unprecedented. He's marched them to the sea,
There, pursued by the most powerful army in the world, he's led them to freedom and destroyed that army. Then he takes them to Sinai, where he ascends the mountaintop and brings them down divine revelation. Now, you'd think the people would be grateful, but as we all know, they're far from grateful. They complain constantly. Standing at the foot of the Red Sea, they complain that they're going to be destroyed by the Egyptians. As soon as they're over, they're complaining again. Even after seeing what he did to the Egyptian army, they complain all the way to Sinai, where, of course, while he's on the mountaintop, they engage in the ultimate act of betrayal, worshiping the golden calf. But now, the Egyptians are defeated. The Torah is given. Moshe has organized the people into tribes and into groups. The Mishkan is built, and they are ready to take their trip through the Sinai towards the Promised Land. And once again, the people complain. But Moshe has had it. So we get to Bamidbar 11:11, and Moses turns to God and says, "Why have you done this to me? Why have you laid this burden on me? I can't carry these people myself. It's too much for me. If this is how it's going to be, just kill me now so I can escape my wretchedness." So the question I want to ask, the part that's puzzling to me, is not his complaint. I mean, the people are impossible. But why now? Why at this moment does Moshe lose it? After all, he has been dealing with these people for well over a year through the desert in times of crisis, and yet at this particular moment, he seems to despair. And I think the reason is because the situation of the people of Israel have transitioned from what we might think of as an acute crisis to a chronic one. When a person has a terrible accident or a stroke or learns of a serious illness, they and their families are mobilized. There's shock, there are decisions to be made, crises to be averted. There are often immediate and emergency actions to be taken. The family and everyone comes together over this great sense of uncertainty. But eventually, the acute phase of the crisis passes. Now the injury or disease has to settle into being a part of life, and the change is very difficult. We have to figure out how to manage day-to-day living with the disease or injury. We have to cope with long-term reactions to our loss of function, or ongoing treatment, or the need for caregivers, aides, and other people in our lives. In some ways, this chronic period is even more difficult than the acute one. The adrenaline is no longer flowing. And that's why Moses loses it at that moment. The strain of hearing endless complaints as a part of everyday life moving forward seemed much harder to him than dealing with them as a part of an ongoing series of crises. And that's the situation we all face now. We're beginning the transition from the fear and uncertainty of COVID to what everyone is calling the new normal. But that's really just the transition from an acute situation of uncertainty and fear to a chronic one, to figuring out, how do we live with this virus in our midst? How do we carry on our daily lives with the threat of COVID over our heads? And so it was with Moshe. He had to transition for at least a time from being a military leader to a management leader. And it's a lot harder to see the heroics in the day-to-day management than it is in the military victory. But those heroic moments are there. Moses fetches, and God's solution is to get him some help, some allies, collaborators. He says to Moses, "Bring together your top 70 elders with management experience to share this burden with you." And Moshe does, and he never complains to God the same way again. Transitioning to daily living with a disease or with COVID takes a different kind of courage than when the disease was new. And as Moshe discovered, it also takes a different kind of leadership. Can we all make the transition to living with COVID? Can we find the courage to fully live in the new normal? Can we find the collaborators to face this together and find solutions together? I think that is the real question of COVID, and I pray that we all can.
Chag Sameach. My name is Craig Taubman, and I'm honored that Rabbi Nicole Guzik and Rabbi David Wolpe have invited me to be a part of this Shavuot celebration. My challenge was to come up with a response to the question, this is the Torah the world needs to hear. God help the world if they need to hear it from me, but I'll give it a shot. This is my Torah during these extraordinary times. As an artist, extraordinary times are opportunities for change, opportunities for discovery, opportunities to learn new things about myself, about my family, about my friends, about my community, about my work, about the world. And whereas they might be scary, for me, I have a sense of overwhelming excitement and motivation to change. I'm going to sing a song now, which I wrote many years ago during the first Gulf War, when bombs were dropping from Iraq onto Israel. And I wrote a song based on the text, "The world is a very narrow bridge. Don't be afraid to cross it." To me, that is the essence of my Torah, that during new times and scary times, don't be afraid to cross the bridge. It's only a journey across a very narrow bridge. Life is a journey. We don't know where we're going. You can't hide from it. Don't dare fear from it. And there will be moments when wrong seem to be right. You must cross the darkness before you see the light. Life is a journey across a very narrow bridge. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher, gesher tzameo. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher, gesher tzameo. From every direction, there will be roads to choose. And if we're lucky, we'll like the ones we use. Life is a journey across a very narrow bridge. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher, gesher tzameo. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher, gesher tzameo. Kol ha'olam kulo. We can cross that bridge, not be afraid to cross the bridge. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher, gesher tzameo. Chag Sameach. Don't be afraid to cross the bridge.
Chag Sameach. I'm Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, the Senior Rabbi of Central Synagogue in Manhattan. And I'm so pleased to be invited by your Rabbi, David Wolpe, to share in a teaching for your Tikkun Leil Shavuot. I had the pleasure of visiting your community for a beautiful Friday night live service on a different trip to LA, and I was always hoping I'd get an invitation to come back. I just didn't know it would be on Zoom. I guess one of the great silver linings of this quarantine is that we can connect with communities across the country and even the world in ways that we didn't consider doing before. Now, I'm actually from the West Coast. I'm a transplanted New Yorker. I grew up in the thriving Jewish metropolis of Tacoma, Washington. Actually, it was an incredibly wonderful place to grow up. I have now adopted the ironically provincial worldview of New Yorkers that we're the center of the universe. Now, sadly, this is not a time that you want to feel that way. And in this time of the pandemic, New York has truly been an epicenter, and my community has suffered a staggering number of losses. Just during this period of Omer, we have had more than 60 deaths in our community. So the danger is real. But the fear about the future of our own lives, but also of our economy and of the world as we know it, it has been so paralyzing for some. And you don't have to live in New York to feel this sense of uncertainty and fear. And as it turns out, you don't even have to live in this time or this century to have this very real reaction to what is uncertain and unknown. I've always found that one of the most amazing things about studying Torah is being reminded we've been here before. We keep saying these are unprecedented times, which they are. But in a sense, our people has actually lived through other similar times. And sometimes you come across a piece of ancient text and it reminds you of this. And I find it strangely comforting. So the Torah that I think we need to hear right now comes from the Talmud, or the oral Torah from Yevamot 63b. And it reminds us of this. It says, "Do not suffer from tomorrow's trouble." That is, do not worry about problems that might arise in the future, as you do not know what a day will bring. Perhaps, when tomorrow comes, the individual who was so worried will not be among the living, and he was consequently upset over a world that is not his. Now, I don't know if it's so comforting to imagine that, why worry about the future? You could be dead tomorrow. That's what the text says. I do think there is such wisdom, however, in looking to the future and creating the worst possible catastrophe scenario and spending so much time thinking about what might be that we're not able to actually be present in the moment that we have, in the gift of each day that we are given. Right after this paragraph comes another very interesting paragraph that at first looks like it's not related, but I actually think is deeply related. It says, "Prevent a public crowd from inside your house. Do not let many people enter, and do not even bring all your friends into your house. Make sure, however, that a crowd seeks your welfare and that you have many allies." Think about that. This text, which at first was about fear, now is talking about a form of, rabbinic era social distancing. It says, don't let there be a crowd in your house. Don't even let your friends inside. We feel like it's unprecedented to have social distancing, but it looks like they did the same thing back then. So part of the distinction the Talmud is making is, while you're not to fear what might be in the future, you also should not be cavalier about real and present danger. Danger is real, and you have to do things to protect yourself from very real and present danger, like social distancing. However, imagining the worst and fearing what might be does not help us live our best lives now. Most importantly, it says, make sure, even if you are separated from all of your friends, that you find a crowd that seeks your welfare and will be your allies. And that's part of the important lesson we're all learning, is finding ways to create our allies and connect with them even in this time. So my wish for you is that you're able to protect yourself in all the ways you need to, but that you don't live in fear. And there's a beautiful last stanza in the beautiful piyut Adon Olam, which we often end services with. And it reminds us of this truth, that do not live in fear, not only because we'll do what we need to do to keep ourselves safe, but also because we are not alone. We are in the hands of God. So I share this last line, Biado afkid ruchi. In your hand, God, I commit my spirit, whether I'm asleep or I'm awake, my spirit and my body. God, you are with me, and I will not fear. Biado afkid ruchi, be'eti sham v'ya'ira, be'im ruchi gevi'ati, Adonai li v'lo ira, v'lo ira. Chag Sameach, everyone.
When I was thinking about a message that I was inspired by and that I thought might be interesting to share, I was taken back to this quote that I love from a musical that I loved when I was younger and that I still love, Rent. And Jonathan Larson, who wrote it, wrote this great line, and he says, "The opposite of war is not peace, but creation." And I love that. Like, I think about it all the time. In these moments of uncertainty and chaos where we feel like we don't have the answer and everything is ravaged all around us, and there's anger and confusion, the opposite of that is not inaction, and the opposite of that is not that it all goes away. The only way to combat that is to make something, and to meet action and this sort of violent action with positive action, to replace destruction with a creation of some kind. And like, what can you do as a person when the whole world feels like it is falling apart around you? What can you make? What can you give? And that can manifest in so many ways, whether that's creating a piece of art or planting a seed, literally, of a flower that can grow into something bigger, or to give someone love in some way and create a kind of bond. I mean, there are so many manifestations of what creation can mean. For me as an artist, I think, what kind of good and worthwhile art can you put in the world that can combat these scary times? And I always come back to it, and it gives me something that feels like it's actionable. Instead of waiting for peace, instead of waiting for the perception of what the opposite of the chaos is, how do we each take some personal responsibility to create something amidst the chaos, and create something beautiful to combat it? And yeah, that's what I'm thinking a lot about. What can we add? What can we create? What can we make in these times when we feel like there is war going on all around us? The opposite of war is not peace, but creation.
My name is Frank Luntz, and it's very humbling to have this responsibility to try to explain, as a professor, or as I like to say, a teacher, what the Torah can teach us today. And to me, it's the teaching of the Torah that is most enlightening. Those who teach it and those who read it and try to understand it, they're seeking the truth. And I think that in this day and age, that is the highest value, the highest purpose that you can have, is to be seeking the truth and to tell it without fear. The second value is humility, the willingness to admit to yourself and admit to others that you don't know all the facts, that you don't know all of what you should know. And I know that as I get older, as I have more students and more classes under my belt, I always begin my lectures with acknowledging what I don't know, that I try to teach them humility to admit that we are not always right, that what we think of as the truth today, we may realize in the future isn't that way. Third is forgiveness, the idea that it doesn't matter whether people are right or wrong. It doesn't matter whether they agree or disagree with you, that you have the humility and the willingness to forgive others, and you ask them to forgive yourself for interpretations or for stories that, as you get more experiences, you get more knowledge, you realize were simply wrong. And fourth is the idea of knowledge. And there's a difference, because I separate knowledge from wisdom. Knowledge is knowing the information. Knowledge is knowing the stories. Wisdom is knowing how to explain them, how they fit together, how they relate. Knowledge is what I, as a teacher, have. Wisdom is what rabbis have, to be able to explain the context and be able to connect to you individually and personally. Sixth is respect. The idea that we respect those who came before us, we respect those who set tradition before us, that we respect those who know more, so much more than we will ever know. And that respect should both be spoken and observed. We can't ask people to respect us until we respect others. To me, the relevance of the Torah, the seventh value that matters the most, is courage. And that's the courage to say things that others may not want to hear. The courage to search for the truth and to acknowledge that you may have had it wrong before. The courage to admit that the more you learn, the better off you become, and the courage to take a different point of view. Some of the greatest teachings of the Torah are people whose definitions of it are not the same today that may have been 20 years ago or 200 years ago, but we have the courage to reflect. Number 8, and it's something that I'm afraid that us in the Jewish community don't do enough and don't feel enough, is kindness, how we treat others. It's a constant story that we read and we remember, not only on Shabbat, not only on the holidays, but every day of the year. It's something that we are taught. It's a story that exists throughout the Torah, how people, either the great stories of those who treat each other with kindness or those who don't, and how in the end that they are better off when they do. 9th is the pursuit of a better life, and this is the only thing to me about the Torah and about the teaching of it. It's the idea that we, no matter how righteous we are now, that we can still do better. No matter how good we are to others, we can still give more. No matter what we have learned, we can still learn more. It's that pursuit of improvement, that pursuit of being a better person, being a better father and mother, being a better son or daughter, that pursuit of something better. And 5th, and 10th, just did it right there, a mistake. And 10th is the respect for life itself. And I know that I have been challenged over the last few years to appreciate and be grateful for the gift of life and to do everything I can to make that gift better for others. So that's where the Torah is still relevant to me, and more relevant than it has ever been. These 10 values: truth, humility, forgiveness, knowledge, wisdom, respect, courage, kindness, the pursuit of a better life, and life itself. That is my humble contribution to this study of today's Torah. Thank you.
This is the Torah that we need, the gift of being lost. We are clearly in a kind of wilderness right now, that space between life as we knew it and life on the other side, with so much uncertainty in between, that chasm of not knowing without any sure guide. People can't calendar when they'll get back to work, if at all, when we'll see our friends and if we'll be able to hug them, when we'll sit in our favorite coffee shop, or if it will even survive the economic standstill. We are living with daily indefiniteness. Many of us are really bad at uncertainty. Okay, I'll speak for myself. I am really bad at uncertainty. I like to know the plan. But we are without a map for this moment, and our Torah happens to have a blueprint for that. It's the journey we're in right now, between Exodus and Shavuot, happening as I record this, the road between redemption and revelation. Just think how uncertain and anxiety-producing that wilderness must have been for our ancestors. Yet, despite doubting Moses and his assurances about a better life in a better land, we didn't run from the wilderness. We walked through it and were changed by it. Some had faith, some didn't, but we discovered unexpected gifts in the in-between. I think that's a lesson for us now. Our tradition tells us to keep moving forward, to find blessing wherever we are, no matter how we are tested. This Torah reminds me of Rebecca Solnitz's book, A Field Guide to Getting Lost. These are my favorite lines. Leave the door open for the unknown. the door into the dark. That's where the most important things come from. As we've been counting the Omer, those 7 weeks between Passover and Shavuot, we haven't been able to count on very much. Official healthcare directives change so regularly that it makes our heads spin and it spikes our shpilkus. Government projections on resuming routine still depend on a million variables. We are indeed lost right now. We can't know the end game. But as we shelter in place, we have rediscovered unexpected gifts in this desert, reading books again, walking, cooking, refilling the empty nest, connecting via technology. We have relearned the preciousness of togetherness in its absence and the strangeness of mourning when we can't gather at a graveside or shiva. We didn't necessarily choose, as Solnit puts it, to leave the door open for the unknown, but it's not swinging shut anytime soon. And so the Torah I'm leaning on in this moment is that trek through the wilderness between Egypt and Sinai, knowing our ancestors were there before us and that they just kept on walking.
Hello, this is Jonathan Safran Foer, reporting to you from Brooklyn, New York, on an unseasonably beautiful day, which also stands in very stark opposition to these unsettling times that we're living through. The Torah that the world needs to hear right now, I think, is that we need to change. I was raised in a conservative household, but one that was not driven by belief. It was driven instead by the idea that Judaism and Torah offer lessons for recognizing the imperfections of the world and the imperfections of ourselves, and ways of thinking about responding to those imperfections. This is something that's been on my mind quite a bit recently with respect to climate change. I, probably like everyone watching this, have known about climate change for years. I've never doubted what the scientists have told us, but I've had a hard time believing it. Believing it in the sense of moving what is in my head into my heart and ultimately through my hands to change the world. And over the past couple of years, I've given up on a certain kind of belief in favor of action. I'm changing my life in concrete ways that I can codify with days of the week and numbers and share with others. For years, I said I should fly less. This year, I decided I won't fly for any vacations. For years, I said my consumerism, whether it's purchasing things through Amazon or the kinds of foods that I eat, are bad for the environment. And this year, I've started to make some pretty dramatic changes, including not eating any animal products before dinner, and making a very concerted effort not to order anything online. I think that this shift in my own life from belief to action, or one might even say from the heart into the hands, was really inspired by the kind of Judaism that I was taught when I was young. At the end of the day, the planet doesn't care if we attend marches, and it certainly doesn't care about the identities that we present to others at dinner parties or these days, I suppose, on Zoom conferences. The planet only cares about what we do, and the world is only changed by what we do. That's an idea that's very deeply embedded in the Torah, and that in this singularly fragile moment that we're now experiencing, that is filled not only with despair, but with really profound hope. Hope that things can change, hope that we will take the lessons that we've learned over the last couple of months and apply them rather than forget them. In this time, I think each of us needs to question not what it is that we think and not what it is that we feel, or not only what we think and feel, but what we can do.
I was catching up with my friend Emily the other day. She'd spent most of her time in quarantine with her husband and 2 young children, building a groundbreaking emergency platform connecting hospitals with PPE providers and donors so that supplies could be purchased and sent directly to the destinations where they were most needed. She told me that the previous Friday evening, after working tirelessly for weeks on end, she was just about to open a bottle of wine and have a relaxing Shabbat with her husband when her phone rang. A Jewish senior center urgently needed PPE, and they hoped that she could help. Of course, without a second thought, she sprang into action. A few hours later, they had what they needed. How many of us in the past 2 months have dropped everything to act, to call a loved one who got sick, to check in on friends who lost someone, to make a contribution to an organization providing direct services to essential workers, or to put on a mask and gloves and show up ourselves to deliver supplies or build a field hospital? How many of us have had to adapt abruptly to a heartbreaking new reality, stay away from elderly parents, close businesses, learn to homeschool children while maintaining a marriage, a home, and a career? Thousands of Orthodox Jews whose communities were exposed early and dramatically to the coronavirus jumped to donate plasma to fight the pandemic in hard-hit cities like New York. Jewish philanthropists who didn't even know each other immediately and collectively mobilized to save communal institutions that they had never previously supported. Jewish humanitarian aid organizations got their hands on gloves and masks and sent volunteers to food pantries to sort and distribute meals for those facing mounting food insecurity. In normal times, we are a thoughtful, introspective, and may I even say argumentative people. We debate, meditate, and contemplate. But during this crisis, I have really come to value and appreciate a central component of our Jewish legacy, something we think about a lot on Shavuot, na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will listen, or we will do and we will understand, in that order. Sometimes there are moments when we're called to action and we must follow our instincts even before our brains have had the opportunity to catch up. When we stood at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, we committed ourselves to being a people of action even more than a people of intention. Our history illustrates how seriously we have taken that mandate. The Jewish story is one of resilience, of new beginnings, of urgent action, of restoration after devastation. When we left Egypt and moved through the desert on that first Zionist voyage, Moses built community and even governance in the wilderness. When we finally made it to the land of Israel, we created a full new Jewish civilization in our ancestral home. During our millennia in exile, we built a thriving diaspora, Jewish communities all over the world connected by faith and peoplehood, praying toward Jerusalem. After the Shoah, Ashkenazi Jews started over once again, creating centers of Jewish life in America and in Israel. Emancipated through Zionism, Jewish survivors, 3 years out of the death camps, built a sovereign, independent state from the ground up in the middle of the desert. Mizrahi Jews, Ethiopian Jews, Soviet Jews, and Iranian Jews, all facing religious and ethnic persecution in the 20th century, sought and found refuge in countries that would protect them, but in communities they'd have to create out of nothing for themselves. Over and over, the Jewish people have picked ourselves up, rebuilt, started over with little time to think or process. We've taken action to repair the world, to create a world that we want to live in, a miracle every single time. There's another lesson from Sinai in that even in this holiest Jewish moment, receiving our sacred text, even while we were all together, every Jewish soul from the past, the present, and the future, we were not alone there. We stood shoulder to shoulder with the mixed multitudes, people of all nations with whom we have always been in relationship, people we've lived among and broken bread with, people who may not share our faith, but share our humanity. Today, we act na'aseh, not just for ourselves, but for our non-Jewish friends and neighbors. We act for the communities most marginalized, most affected on the front lines of this crisis. We can see, maybe more clearly than ever before, just how broken this world is. Communities of color are facing shockingly disproportionate infection and death rates. Women are suffering from domestic abuse and attempts to exploit this impossible moment to roll back long-settled reproductive freedoms. Anti-Asian racism and anti-Semitism are resulting in physical and emotional attacks on communities who are being scapegoated by anyone looking for someone to blame. Forced isolation has exacerbated an already existing loneliness epidemic that affects millions of people and actually shortens an individual's life expectancy. Those who were vulnerable before the coronavirus are astronomically more vulnerable now. So we must lead, and we must start now, even before the quarantine is lifted and life resumes. People need our help. Our contemplation and reflection on the state of the world will not feed their families, cure their ailments, find them jobs, or pay their rent. Right now, we must not say, do, even though we don't have the answers, even though the world's most prolific scientists and doctors don't have the answers, even though we haven't yet been able to nishma, to understand the lessons of this moment, or let those lessons dictate our behavior for the future. There will be time for nishma, hearing, contemplating, understanding. I have no doubt that we Jews will continue to argue, analyze, and explore existential questions. One day, which I pray is soon, the urgency will pass, we'll find a new normal, and we'll enjoy the fruits of our labor in a world that has more justice and less pain. In the meantime, I feel immense pride in knowing that the Jewish people strive to be like Emily, taking action to better our broken world, and that will not aseh until we have the luxury of the opportunity to nishma. Chag Sameach.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO and National Director of the ADL. Shavuot, the holiday when we celebrate the giving of the Torah to the Jewish people, comes this year at a time when hate and disease are rampant in the world. I believe the Torah has important messages for us in this time that this year are critical to take heed of. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love thy neighbor as thyself, is a central theme throughout Torah. This applies to us as individuals, the Shavuot, and it also applies to us as a community. Standing up against anti-Semitism and all forms of hate, whether one hears it from a neighbor or from a source in the media, from an elected official, even a religious figure, it's critical to stand up and speak out when you hear hate. Frankly, this isn't an ADL value, it's a Torah value. And we need to stand against anti-Semitism as a collective community. Loving thy neighbor in this context means that we can come together and not allow politics or partisan interests to distort how we view anti-Semitism or any type of bigotry. You see, anti-Semitism can come, and unfortunately does, emanate from the left and from the right, from majority communities and minority groups. The only way we can defeat it and fulfill the Torah mission is to speak up wherever and whenever it rears its ugly head. You know, Shavuot and the giving of Torah, it also speaks to us as COVID-19 is raging through our country and really the world. The giving of Torah at Sinai was the culmination of the freedom that the Jewish people received from their bondage in Egypt. It joined a spiritual dimension to the physical liberation represented by the Exodus. It offered a path forward for a nation that was critical at a time as they were able to move from the depths of slavery to the hopes for a life of freedom and morality. During these trying times, it can be tempting to succumb to despair, but the Torah tells us otherwise. And there's no better example that will allow us to see that value at work than to observe how Holocaust survivors who endured hell itself never gave up, how they escaped from the shadow of the Shoah and rebuilt their lives and re-energized our community. The Torah informs us that a better world is possible, but it will not happen by itself. It depends on all of us, the decisions we make, how we treat one another, and identifying what are the things that really matter in life. You see, ultimately, the Torah is about redemption. Redemption from evil, redemption from hate, redemption from sickness, redemption from disease. But ultimately, Hashem invests in us the power and the responsibility to make that happen. He asks of us this Shavuot to recognize the gift that is Torah, but with our own hands to realize its potential and make it meaningful in the world around us. Thank you. Chag Sameach.
I'm Eisen from the Jewish Theological Seminary. The Torah we need for our time and for any time is the message that originally comes from Sinai, namely that for reasons we can't understand, but in a call to which we must respond, the world is not just enough, and we have to help it make more so. The world is not compassionate enough, and we're here to help make the world more compassionate. We know this all the time, and now at the time of the virus, with the suffering that we're witnessing, with the inequities that we're seeing, with the lack of justice and the lack of compassion on the one hand, and the surfeit of justice and compassion from other quarters on the other hand, it's more than ever obvious that this way that Torah teaches of justice and compassion is one that is relevant for our time as for all times. The personal, existential meaning of Torah, the idea that Torah is a tree of life to them that hold fast to it, came to me personally, especially one Shavuot, when I was finishing up my studies in Oxford, England, where I'd been there studying during the Yom Kippur War, and was about to make my way to a new chapter in my life in Israel. And it struck me as I was giving the Hag B'Aliyah, and I held the Torah while it was being wrapped, and while the rest of the service was transpiring until the Torah was put back in the ark, how much the Torah was a tree of life to me who was holding on to it. I knew that no matter where I went in life, I wouldn't lose my way if Torah was with me. And equally important, I knew that if Torah was with me and I was with Torah, I wouldn't lose myself. That lesson which I first learned in 1975 is as true for me now in 2020 as it's ever been. And I think it's true for all of us that we're in desperate need of wisdom. We're in desperate need of some surety in our life, knowing that there's truth with a capital T and we can serve it, and there's right with a capital R and we can do right, knowing that we can be a source of goodness, we can be a source of blessing, we can choose life. And Torah is here, as always, to teach Jews how to do that. The Torah is set up this way as a manual of instruction which reaches out to us and doesn't just sit there but calls upon us to interpret it and help us understand it, and doesn't want to sit there as a work of literature or as a work of art or as a work of history, but wants to be a story that we write the next chapter of, that we are here to live and complete. The Torah sets up a people, it sets up a relationship to one another, to the world, and to God, and it sets up a project. Covenant is a project which all of us are called upon to join at every point in our lives, but certainly right now, in the crisis that we're all going through, it's so obvious the difference that we're making to one another, and that certain individuals who are engaging in great self-sacrifice are making to our society as a whole and to the world. Torah calls us to this task now as ever, this Shavuot as every Shavuot. And I hope we will respond to this call to life and say, we're here, we're ready, we're going to do it.
Hi, I'm Neshama Carlebach, and this is the Torah that the world needs to hear. We begin with song. Days are coming, days are coming, days are coming, days are coming. There'll be a hunger in the world. There'll be a hunger in the world. But the hunger will not be for bread, and the thirst will not be for water. but the hunger will not be for bread, and the thirst will not be for water, but to hear the word of God. So here we are about to celebrate Shavuot together, apart but together. And I don't believe there has been or there ever will be a Shavuot like this, where each of us are just encased in our own homes, in our own feelings, in our own fears, in our own challenge. We learn that on Shavuot, which is such a glorious holiday, we learn that there are actually two Torahs that the world is receiving. One is the Torah of Sinai, the one we already know. And that Torah, which was given to the generations and generations before us, that comes to us automatically. Even if we don't know that that day is Shavuot, even if we're not learning anything, even if we're not thinking about it, that is a Torah that is ours to receive. We walk through the desert for it. We already earned it. It is ours. But there is a second kind as well, and that we call the Torah of mistakes. And that's a Torah that we don't receive automatically. That is something we have to beg for, we have to cry for, we have to hunger for. It's the Torah where we relive our own journey through the desert. It's the Torah that we have to really, really look deep inside and see ourselves to receive. I believe that this moment calls for something more for us, from us, friends. It's not enough just to receive the Torah of our culture, of our lives, the story that we've carried all along. It's time for us to create our own story. It's time for us to stand tall, to receive our own mistakes, to forgive ourselves, to forgive the world, to love the world just a little bit more, and to receive the word of God in a way that's just a little bit different. And I know that we can do it. I know that when we put our minds, our hearts to it, I know that we are somehow, humanity is somehow ready for something more, to receive something more, to hear the word of God. May it be soon. Hine yamim ba'im ne'um Hashem vishlach tirav ba'aretz lo Rav lalechem v'lo tzama lamayim Hine yamim ba'im ne'um Hashem vishlach tirav ba'aretz lo Rav lalechem v'lo tzama lamayim Lo rav lalechem lo tzama lamayim Ki et devar Hashem Lo rav lalechem lo tzama lamayim Ki im lishmoa et devar Hashem Chag Sameach. Please be well.
This is the Torah the world needs to hear. In a free society where terrible wrongs exist, some are guilty, but all are responsible. These words of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel are so powerful for me in my Jewish, professional, political, and personal lives that I feel tempted to say, as Hillel once did, this is the essence of our faith. Go, study, be guided by these words. The rest is commentary. But with thanks to Rabbi Wolpe for asking me to participate in this project, I want to unpack these words of Heschel and unpack them at this moment in the history of the world. We live in a world of great wealth and severe poverty, of unimaginable privilege and terrifying threat, of ever-growing gaps between the haves and have-nots. We know the numbers, or rather, the numbers are there, but we have to absorb them, acknowledge them, and determine how we want to respond. Some examples. This country's 3 richest individuals collectively hold more wealth than the bottom 50% of the domestic population. Every year in the United States, more than 10 million women and men are victims of physical violence by an intimate partner. Vast numbers of families have been separated at our southern border, and we are on track to deny entry to almost all immigrants in 2020. And we are living through a public health crisis for which we are acutely ill-prepared, watching death tolls rise in urban centers, in rural hotspots, in assisted living centers. This virus is hurting poor people and people of color, creating many more deaths in those communities, exposing the inequities and injustices of our healthcare system. And it is also projected to cause serious illness and death in the global south of a magnitude significantly larger than in the United States. As Jews, we know what to do. We need to help the poor and hungry, the abused, the immigrant and stranger, the severely ill. We need to help both Jews and non-Jews. We need to do more than weep, wring our hands, or fast. We need to do more, as demanding as that may seem, to tackle not just the immediate problem, but its causes. We are directed to build a society more centrally committed to justice, a place where people are free from systemic racism, where there are ways to escape oppression and abuse, where families are not torn apart by government officials, a society and a world where children and women and people of color and people with disabilities and people of every faith are seen as equally made in the image of God. That is what Heschel meant when he urged us to focus less on where the guilt lies in creating the problem and more on what our responsibility is to change the systems that perpetuate it. That means working with the people whose lives are most at risk. It means organizing for social change. It means pulling like-minded people together and advocating to policymakers and elected officials that they do their work to help heal the world. Our own Midrash has something to say about this. Quote, "If a person of learning participates in public affairs and serves as judge or arbiter, they give stability to the land. But if they sit in their home and say to themselves, 'What have the affairs of society to do with me? Why should I trouble myself with the people's voices of protest? Let my soul dwell in peace.' If one does this, they overthrow the world." This is the Torah that the world needs to hear. Leap in, take responsibility, exercise the privileges of our citizenship and our democracy, and do all we can to make a difference. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Shai Held from the Hadar Institute in New York. I wanted to share 2 thoughts about the kind of society I believe God and Torah demand that we build, and that this moment in particular and what we've been living through should especially prod us to take to heart. I want to talk about compassion and care, and also about human solidarity. So first, compassion and care. The book of Deuteronomy, Sefer Dvarim, does a very odd thing. It praises the land of Israel by comparing it to the land of Egypt. The land of Egypt, it says, irrigates itself in effect. The Nile provides water, the land is always irrigated, and crops can grow reliably. But the land of Israel, in contrast, and remember, this is supposed to be to Israel's credit and praise, the land of Israel, in contrast, is entirely dependent on the rain and therefore experienced as entirely dependent upon God. The land of Israel is better than the land of Egypt, we are told, is more desirable because the rain is less reliable. Now that's very odd. If you were a farmer, you might be inclined to say, well, I think the opposite is the case. I'll take Egypt. But the issue, according to the Torah, is that the land of Israel makes it harder to take what you have for granted. The land of Israel teaches us that we are vulnerable and dependent always. Now, on one level, that's a kind of theological commitment, because what we're being told is that we may not forget our dependence on God, and therefore we always need to nurture and cultivate our sense of gratitude and indebtedness for the blessings God bestows upon us. But at another level, I want to suggest living in a land where it is extraordinarily hard to forget our dependence and vulnerability has major moral consequences. And those consequences are that vulnerability has the potential to teach us compassion. As I awake to my own vulnerability, I empathically awaken to other people's vulnerability as well. Vulnerability makes it possible to be compassionate rather than to show pity. Pity is fundamentally a vertical posture. When I pity someone, I reach down to them, harboring the illusion all the while that I am somehow superior to them and that what has happened to them could never happen to me. Compassion, in contrast, is a horizontal posture. When I have compassion for someone, I reach across to them with a sense of deeply shared humanity, knowing that what has happened to them could happen to any of us simply by dint of our being human beings and being fragile, vulnerable, dependent, not fully autonomous. To embrace vulnerability is to open the door to the possibility of deeper and deeper compassion. And compassion in Judaism is the highest level a person can achieve in this lifetime, what the Rambam Maimonides refers to as Tachlit Ma'alat Ha'adam, the very highest level a person can achieve. That is walking in God's ways, V'halachta b'drachav. That is godliness, according to Judaism. We live in a society that does not always value care and does not always value those who care in adequate ways, to say the least. First, in terms of care, does every child who goes through a Jewish school or attends a Jewish camp or lives in a Jewish home learn without equivocation that compassion and kindness and caring for those who are vulnerable is more important than success or academic achievement? Do we have a society in which those who care are paid in ways that reflect how much we claim to value them? These are crucial questions. They are not just moral or political questions. They are also, in some deep way, theological questions. Can we build, will we build a society animated by profound care and concern? I would just add here that the feminist philosopher Nell Noddings points out something I think is arrestingly powerful. She says that what feminism has achieved is that professions that were formerly open only to men are for the most part now open to women too. But what feminism has not yet achieved, what we as a society have not yet achieved, is the realization that men too should be able to embrace professions that were formerly given over to women, caring professions, and to see them as equally prestigious, equally valuable, as things they would long to do. In other words, it's one thing for women to become corporate lawyers, but it will be another thing when men unequivocally become nurses and school teachers. That's a world in which care and nurturing and compassion are really held up as ideals. That's a society living up to the values of Torah. Now, very quickly, a word about human solidarity. The book of Genesis, Sefer Breshit, tells us famously that God creates everything. God creates animals and birds and plants. But the book of Genesis is not content to tell us simply that God creates those things, but it tells us instead that God creates each of those things of every kind. Limino, liminam, liminehem. Again and again we hear that God creates birds of all their kinds, animals of all their kinds, plants of all their kinds, beasts in all their kinds. We have a kind of ode to biodiversity in Genesis 1. And then comes the creation of the human being. And we expect to hear, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam b'tzalmo lemino. And God created the human being in God's image in all their many kinds. But the word lemino, in all their kinds, is absent here. As if to say, there are no kinds of human beings. Later on, Genesis will defend diversity, will resist the idea of one society speaking one language. But before it does that, it first tries to instill a sense of fundamental human solidarity, a solidarity rooted in our shared createdness. We are all human beings created in the image of God. We are at a moment in which we are obligated to sacrifice for each other, in which we are obligated in new ways to care for each other. And this is a moment to take more seriously than ever our obligations and what our theology really tells us is an elemental truth about the world, and that is that we are all of one kind. Chag Sameach, and best wishes for safety and health to you and all your loved ones, to all of Israel, and to the entire world.
We have completed our journey of study together. I hope that these voices have inspired you as they have inspired me. And I pray that the year to come, with all of its challenges, will be for all of us a year of health, a year of growth, a year of goodness, and a time of peace. Chag Sameach.